Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of 5 lectures that I'm going to do on the subject of what is wrong with the world. And I want to begin today with the basic problem that we all have to face. And this is that human beings have rejected the love of God. We need to look at this in some depth in order to appreciate just how serious a problem it is. When God created the world, He created it as an act of love. We don't understand why He decided to do the things that He did. We don't really know why the world is here. But we know that the one who made it, the God who made it because He wanted to. It was His desire to do this. And of course, because it was His desire to do this, He loves the things that He has made. God is not indifferent to His creation. There are some people who think that God made the world and then went away and did other things, that He wasn't interested in it, that He didn't bother with looking after it once the work was completed. But this is not true. God is always interested in the things that He has made and in the world that He has made. He governs the world. He wants to make sure that the creation that He has made functions in the way that He originally intended. In this respect, God has a relationship with the world and with everything in it. Now, of course, this relationship is different according to the creatures that He has made. The rocks and the trees and the animals and things like that, God controls, God looks after, God protects in the way that they are, but He does not have what we would call a personal relationship with them. They cannot speak back to Him. We might compare this with the furniture in our own house. When you have a house, you have chairs and you have tables and you have beds and you have different articles of furniture. You may have pictures on the walls and so on, different things in your house, and you like them, you take care of them, you make sure that they are in good working order, but you would not say that you have a personal relationship with them. It is, of course, very different with other human beings. If you have children, then you cannot treat children in the way that you would treat a chair or a table. You look after them, of course, you take care of them, you make sure that they are okay, that there is no problem with them, but you also have a relationship with them. You speak to them, they speak back to you, and you live with them in a different way. This, of course, is what God has done with us. We are His children. We are those whom He has made in order to have this kind of personal relationship with Him. And the problem is that the children have rebelled against the Father. That we whom He has made in order to live with Him in His house, in His world, we have rejected this love which He has shown for us. Now, this does not mean that God has abandoned us. God does not reject us in the way that we have rejected Him. As a Father, He continues to love us even though we have disobeyed Him, even though we do not have love for Him. And this is the tragedy of the world in which we live, that the love of God for us is not repaid by the same love that we should have for him. Now, why not? Well, we've already looked at this in our seminar session to some degree, and the rebellion against God, I pointed out there, began with the angels. In particular, it began with one angel, the angel whom we call Satan. Satan rebelled against God, knowing full well what he was doing. Satan was not ignorant. He was close to God. He understood what God was doing. He participated somehow in the work that God was doing in creation. We don't know precisely what Satan did before he fell, but we know that he was present with God and that he was given a very high position in the kingdom of heaven. So Satan could not say that he was unaware, that he did not understand. He did understand. And of course that made everything much worse. He knew what he was doing, and if he had stopped to think about it, he would have realized that rebelling against God was self-defeating, that he could not survive such a thing because he was cutting himself off from the source of his life. But Satan rebelled. Why? Because of his pride. Even though he knew what the consequences would be, he wanted to be independent. He wanted to be his own God. And so he took the risk. He revolted against the Father and established, if you like, a kingdom of his own. He became or was recognized as the prince of this world, of the world which is in rebellion against God. Well, this was true of Satan, but is it true, or was it true, of the first human beings? Did human beings imitate Satan's rebellion in that way? This is a more difficult question to answer. From what the Bible tells us in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve, the first human beings, were created, but they were not given the knowledge of good and evil. So they did not know what the difference was between good and bad. They did not know who Satan was. They were placed in the Garden of Eden, in a paradise where everything was designed to serve them. It was designed to be for their use, and they were given the authority to rule over the animals, to eat the plants, to live in a way which would be pleasing to God. The only thing that God told them was that there were two trees in the garden that they were not to eat. One was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the other was the tree of life. Now, we know, of course, that these trees are symbolic. They represent spiritual realities. They were probably not trees in the normal sense of the word. The story is told in this way so that we will understand it. What really happened is very hard to say because we have not got direct access to the past in this way. But what we do know is that Adam and Eve had limitations placed on their existence. There were two things that they could not do. It was when they disobeyed this, when they crossed the boundaries, when they did something that they were told not to do, that the problem arose. But, of course, here again, we have to recognize that this was not their own independent decision. We cannot say that Adam and Eve woke up one morning in the garden and decided to go and eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They knew that they shouldn't do it, and they had no intention of doing it. They weren't deliberately trying to go against the will of God. What happened? What we are told is that they were tempted by Satan. Satan appeared in the garden in the form of a serpent, so we are told in the story, and he tempted them. And how did Satan tempt them? It's very interesting to look at this. Satan did not say to Adam and Eve, eat this fruit and rebel against God. I've done it. I've rebelled against God. So, why don't you do the same? Why don't you follow me in my rebellion? No, he didn't put it like that. He didn't put it like that because probably if he had, Adam and Eve would not have listened to him. Very few people deliberately choose something which is bad, something which they know is wrong. So Satan tried a different approach, a completely different approach. What he said was, if you eat the fruit of this tree, of the knowledge of good and evil, you will become like God. God knows the difference between good and evil, but you don't. So eat of this fruit of the tree, and then you'll be like him. Why does God not want you to eat of this tree? Well, it may be because God does not want you to be like him. But why should God not want you to be like him? Surely to be like God is a good thing. The more like God that we are, the better it is. Today, of course, we think like this. You see, we want people to obey God, to hear the voice of God, to experience the presence of God in our lives, so that we will be more like him. We are told that we have the mind of Jesus Christ, that we think like him, that we are given the presence of the Holy Spirit in our hearts to make us think and act in the way that God wants us to do. So what could possibly be wrong with becoming more like God? And of course, from one point of view, there is nothing wrong with that. To be more like God is a good thing. And Adam and Eve must have recognized this. You see, that they weren't starting off from the point of view of a desire to get away from God. They wanted to become more like him, to get closer to him. And that was in itself not a bad thing. But what was wrong was that God had told them not to do this. Now, we don't know what God's plan for them was. Did God want to give Adam and Eve a knowledge of good and evil at some time later on in their lives? Perhaps. We have no real answer to that question. What we do know is that he told them not to seek it for themselves. But this was the temptation. This was what Satan held out to them. He said, do this, try this, and you will become like God. Now, initially, they resisted. You see, Eve knew that it was wrong, and she told the serpent that they were not to eat of the tree. But gradually, her resistance was broken down, and she ate of the tree, and then she gave it to Adam to eat as well. Now, Adam should have known better not to do that. Adam should have told Eve, no, you cannot do this. We must leave this alone and go away. And had Adam said that, had Adam done that, then Eve's action would probably have had no effect, because Adam would have exercised his role as the man, as the husband in the relationship, and would have corrected the mistake that his wife had made. But he did not do that. You see, he surrendered to her and ate of the fruit, and of course it was then, when he ate of it, that the real problem began. We need to say this because there is a long tradition in history which wants to blame the woman for the trouble, for the fall which came. And this is not correct. If you look at the New Testament, you will find that whenever the fall of man in the Garden of Eden is mentioned, it is always Adam who is to blame. Adam who is to blame because Adam had the responsibility. He had the responsibility to direct and govern his wife in this particular matter, to inform her that this was not the right thing to do, and not to follow her along these lines. But it was the fact that he did that that brought both of them down. So Adam is really to blame, and has historically been blamed for the fall more than Eve has been blamed. However, from our point of view, it doesn't really make that much difference, because of course they were both in it together. Adam and Eve are equally responsible for what they did, for having listened to the voice of the serpent, to the voice of Satan, and fallen in this way. Now, what happened when they ate? They actually acquired the knowledge of good and evil. You see, the temptation was not entirely false, not entirely wrong. When Satan promised them this, they got what he promised, that their eyes were opened, it said, and they understood what the difference between good and evil was. So in that respect, you could say that Satan was not lying to them. He was telling them something that in itself was true. But, of course, and here we get back to the main point, although it was true, it was wrong, because Adam and Eve had acquired this knowledge in the wrong way. You see, what they got was what was valid. It was true in itself, but they got it in the wrong way, and this is what the problem is, or was, or still is today. You see, the question is not one of knowledge, that they should have the knowledge or not knowledge, but that they acquired it by disobedience. And this is the key. You see, that in our relationship with God, it is not what we know that matters. It is whether we are prepared to obey what he commands. And if we disobey, all the knowledge in the world will serve us no good purpose at all. You see, there is nothing to be gained just from knowledge. Knowledge may be a good thing, but it has to be exercised, it has to be used in the context of obedience to the will of God. And it was because they disobeyed that Adam and Eve fell. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, something that we have to bear in mind, is that when God decided to provide a way of salvation, when God decided to rescue the fallen human race, when God decided to send his Son into the world in order to suffer and to die for us, he did not take away the knowledge of good and evil. You and I still have it. We know what the difference between good and evil is. So in this respect, we have inherited the sin of Adam, if you like. We know these things. We have not had them taken away. And if you say, well, why not? Could God simply have reached into the life of Adam and Eve and taken away this knowledge so that they would go back to the state that they were in before? Well, we cannot say whether God could have done that or not. We don't know the answer to that. But he did not choose to do that. He allowed Adam and Eve to keep this knowledge, even though it was acquired in the wrong way. But he said that because they had disobeyed, they were no longer in the right relationship with him. And this is the nature of the fall. It is an act of disobedience. Now, what are the consequences of this? This is what we have to look at next. Because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they lost the position of trust which they had received in the Garden of Eden. They were, in fact, put out of the garden. They had to leave this paradise. You see, the paradise was taken away from them because they had not shown themselves obedient. They had not shown themselves worthy of the trust and of the responsibility which they had been given. Now, that responsibility was not taken away from them. Adam and Eve remained the greatest of the creatures. The commission which God had given, the mandate which God had given to them to rule over the world, this was not taken away. They were still expected to do that, but without the support, without the benefits, without the knowledge and the relationship with God which they had previously enjoyed. This was the problem. And how do we see this? How is this expressed in the story? Well, it is expressed in the story by saying that when Adam and Eve acquired the knowledge of good and evil, they looked at each other and they realized that they were naked, that they had nothing to protect them. Now, for generations, many people have tried to say this is a comment on human sexuality. And they say that the Bible has a negative attitude towards the human body, towards sex and the enjoyment of material things because of this. But that is not true. That is not the true meaning of this text. The true meaning is that they saw themselves without protection, that there was nobody and nothing to guard against the dangers and the difficulties which might be coming. Because whereas Adam and Eve had an easy life in the garden, once they were thrown out, they had to struggle. They had to struggle with the land in farming and so on. It was going to be hard work. The women would have difficulty in bringing children into the world. Many things which would not have caused problems before were now going to cause difficulty for them because they were exposed to the forces of the world, to the forces of the universe. And it was in this way, for this reason, that they saw themselves as naked. It was a spiritual problem, that the protection which God offered, which God gave them, they no longer had. Now, there are some people who will say that Adam and Eve became subject to death because of their expulsion from the garden. This is partly true, but we need to be careful about how we understand this. Adam and Eve were not immortal beings from the beginning. They were made as mortal creatures, like the animals, and so on. They had birth, they had a life, and they would die at some point. We don't know how that would have operated. We don't have the knowledge to be able to resolve this problem, but they were created as mortal beings. In other words, beings who could, and at some point or other, would die. Whether after death they would have gone to heaven in a new life, this we are not told. We may assume that they would have done, but we don't know the answer to that. All we know is that they were mortal. How do we know this? We know this because when Satan and his followers disobeyed God, when they turned away, they did not die. They did not die because they are immortal. They cannot die. And so they continue in existence, even though their existence is one of rebellion against God. But Adam and Eve, being mortal to begin with, what they lost was the protection which they had in the garden. As long as they were in the garden, they would not die, or if they would not die in the normal human way. But when they were thrown out of the garden, the story tells us that they were cut off from the tree of life. You see, that was the other tree. And God actually says to his angels in Genesis chapter 3, he says, we have to do this. We have to cut them off from the tree of life, because if they eat of the tree of life, then they will become immortal. Then they will live forever. But they would become immortal like the fallen angels, like Satan, in their fallen state. And that God could not permit. God could not permit that because if Adam and Eve had become immortal as fallen creatures, then salvation would not have been possible. You see, this is why the fallen angels, Satan and his demons, cannot be saved. They cannot be saved because they are what they are forever. There is no death. You see, they will not die. They simply stay in this position, in this place, forever. Whereas, of course, human beings do die, and it is through death and rebirth, a recreation, a new life, that the old life of sin and rebellion is taken away, and they are given a new life of obedience to God. This is why, of course, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came into the world. He came into the world not to save the angels, the fallen angels, because he could not do that, but to save you and me. That by dying for you and me, he took our death, our mortality on him, paid the price for our sins, and by coming back from the dead, showed what a new life, a resurrected life, is like. Now, human beings today have inherited the legacy of Adam. All of us are in the same position. I said earlier on in my talk this morning that this is symbolic. That is, the story is put in a way that we can understand. But the fact that it is symbolic does not mean that it is wrong. It does not mean that it is false. Because if you look at the world, if you look at human beings, the remarkable thing is that all people everywhere are in exactly the same position. Every human being stands in the same relationship with God that Adam and Eve had. All of us are created in the image and likeness of God. There are not different classes of human beings, some who are superior to others. We are all the same in this way. And we have all sinned. We have all turned away from God. Furthermore, this turning away is not something that we have deliberately decided to do. It is something that we are born with. It is something that comes into us at the moment of birth, and there is no escape from it. Now, this is the reality that we are faced with. How do we explain it? We just don't know how it originally came to be in the way that it now is. This is a mystery to us, and we have to be honest about this. We have to say that we don't understand exactly how it happened. But at the same time, we also have to say that it has happened. You know, there was a time when some people thought that they could go around the world and they could find people in some very remote places, maybe on a desert island or something like that, who were innocent, who had not been affected by the fall. But they were unable to do this. They called this what is called the noble savage. You see, they thought that people who lived naked in the forests had no conception of sin. They had no idea that they had ever rebelled against God. There was nothing of that, in their minds. And so that if the rest of us went back to that position, went back to that state, we too would be innocent. This is a myth. There are no people like this. You see, when explorers went to the far distant islands or went into the jungles and found tribes that nobody had ever seen before, what they discovered was that they were human beings just like the rest of us, that they had their own understanding of the fall, that they realized that something had gone wrong in their life, and that they were looking for a solution to the basic problem of existence. You see, there has never been any group anywhere in the world which is not like this. It is very important that we understand this, particularly when it comes to the whole question of knowledge and learning. Because our minds have not been materially affected by the fall. I am not less rational as a person now than Adam was before he fell in the garden. The physical capacity to think, to create, and to live in the way that God originally intended for me to live, these things are still there. Some people believe that the image of God in us was lost or corrupted by the fall, but there is no evidence for this in the Bible. We are the same. Our capacities, our abilities are just the same now as they were when we were first made. And it is extremely important that we understand this. Why is it important? Because it's more serious. It makes our condition, our fallen condition, more serious than it would otherwise have been. Let me put it like this. If, as a result of the fall, I had lost some ability to think, some freedom to act, if there was some change in my being that made me an inferior person to what I had been before, then I could say to God, well, I am innocent. What can I do? I am not the creature that you originally made. I am not the Adam that you put in the garden. And therefore, you can tell me that I have gone wrong, that I have done all sorts of things that cut me off from you, but there's nothing I can do about this. You see that I don't have the ability, I don't have anything in me that can turn me back again. And this is not true. It is true that I cannot find my way back into the garden, that I cannot undo the sinfulness which has come into my life and into human life generally because of this. That is true. But it does not mean that I am incapable of living the kind of life that God wants because I am somehow physically or mentally handicapped. You see, sin is not a handicap. It is not a physical disability in that way. What this means, of course, is that salvation is a restoration to what God originally intended for us to be. Now this, of course, brings us back to the question of the knowledge of good and evil. To be saved, to be put back into the right relationship with God that He wanted us to have from the beginning, is not to go back to the Garden of Eden. There can be no return to the garden. How do we know this? Well, it's very interesting that in the Bible, the tree of life, which was in the garden, and which was cut off. You see, where people were cut off from this. They couldn't go near it. When the tree of life reappears in the Bible, as it does at the end of the book of Revelation, when we have the picture of the heavenly kingdom, of the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven, the place where God's people will dwell, the tree of life is present in the middle of the city. It's no longer in the garden, but it is in the city. And what is a city? What is the difference between the city and the garden? The garden is God's creation. You and I did not have any participation in that. I might be able to put plants and flowers in my garden and move them around and so on. But I did not create these things. These things are there because God has made them, and all I can do is arrange them. I can put them in an order. I can do something with them, but I cannot create them out of nothing. A city, on the other hand, represents human activity. A city is something that human beings have built. It is not something that God created as part of nature at the beginning. Now, this does not mean that God did not want cities to be created. It doesn't mean that God hates cities or anything like that. The city is the sign of human creativity, of something that human beings have done because they are created in the image and likeness of God. This is part of what God has planned, if you like, for the human race, that we should develop the natural order, that we should develop the creation, that we should build things, that we should invent things, that we should organize things so that we can live in this new and different way, not in the way of the garden, the original garden, but in the way of a city, of a common life like this. Now, it is not God's purpose, not God's plan, that we should dismantle the cities and all go back to the country, all go back to the garden. Some people think this. You see, they think that the way of salvation is to abandon the life of the city, to abandon the creativity of the human being, and to go off and live in as primitive a way as possible. This is not the message of the Bible. It is not what Christians are called to do. And it's very important that we understand this. You see that the original mandate, the original creation mandate that God gave to Adam and Eve, this has not been taken away by their sin. It has been made more difficult. It has brought with it many problems that need to be addressed. It has caused difficulties in understanding. It has produced different results that God may not originally have intended and that God does not want for us, and so on. These things may be true, but the idea that we should develop, that we should rule over the world which He has given, this has not been taken away. And so when we look at the fall, when we look at the rejection of God's love, we must not see it in that way. We must think of it rather as something which has prevented or has distorted, perhaps better to say, has distorted the command, the mandate which God has given to us. But, of course, we have the knowledge of good and evil. We have the knowledge of good and evil which remains with us and which makes it necessary for us to understand what is evil and to avoid it. You see, knowing about it is not enough. We have to do something about it. We are called to cling to the good, to seek what is good, to avoid what is evil. So along with our knowledge also comes responsibility. Adam and Eve did not have that problem in the garden. They did not have to decide. All they had to do was to obey the command of God, and in that, as we know, they failed because of the temptation. But you and I are commanded by God to use the abilities that we have been given, to use the knowledge that we have been given in order to avoid the sin and the consequences of that sin in our lives. It's not an easy command. It's not even possible for us to do this on our own. Why is it not possible? Because we are naked. We are without protection in the world. Only in and by Jesus Christ, by what He has done for us, is it possible for us to escape the inheritance of sin. That is why the gospel message is so important. The gospel message is the only way of salvation. It is the only way out of the problems that we have. I'm going to come back in the second part of this lecture to look at these things in greater depth, but right now we shall just have a short break and then come back to the second half of the lecture. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody, to the second part of the first lecture today on the rejection of God's love. We were talking just now about the fall of Adam and Eve and its effects on the human race. The name for this, the name that we give to this, is original sin. It's called original sin because it is the thing which began the falling away of the human race from the will of God. Now, what is original sin? It's easy to say that it came about because Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in a sense, of course, that is true, that this was the act which brought original sin into the world. But original sin, as we understand it today, is not an act of that kind. You and I cannot do something, to go deliberately against the will of God and produce our own version of original sin. Some people think this. You see, they think that every human being who comes into the world is innocent. Every human being who comes into the world is somehow a child of God, and that sin only comes into their life when they do something wrong. In other words, that each and every individual creates his or her own original sin. But this is not the teaching of the Bible. The teaching of the Bible is that every human being is born with a broken relationship to God, whether we like it or not. This is not a choice that we are given. What we have to do is consider how we can overcome this sinful state, how we can get rid of the effects of original sin, not how we can avoid it to begin with. We believe that even small children have been born into this sinful state. Now, this is a very hard thing for many people to accept, because you will say to yourself, but how is it possible for a baby who comes into the world to be regarded as a sinner? Surely that is taking things much too far, that this is an extreme interpretation. After all, the baby has not done anything. The baby does not understand what good and evil are. The baby has no way of judging or of deciding for itself, what to do. So how can you blame this baby for something that the baby has no knowledge of? Of course, this is to misunderstand what sin is. There are, in fact, two different aspects to it. First of all, there is the concept of sin as an act, as something that we do. And of course, in this respect, if we think of it like that, then babies do not sin. Of course not, because they got the ability to do this. If we think in terms of actions, of things that we do, most of us probably do not sin very much. For example, the Bible says that we are not to kill, that killing is a sin. But how many of us actually do that? Killing other people is relatively rare. There are people who do this, certainly, but there are not very many of them. And most of us could probably say, well, I've never done that in my life, and so I have not committed that particular sin. What these people are doing, well, if you say this, if you think like this, you are actually regarding sin as a crime, as something that can be punished by the law. And of course, in this way, we are told that killing people, stealing, and many things like this are wrong, they are crimes, and therefore they are sins. But while all crimes are sinful, I think we can say that crime is a sin, not all sins are crimes. Jesus said this, you see, to his disciples, because when you take, for example, the command not to kill, Jesus knew that his disciples had never killed anybody, and that therefore they could see themselves as innocent in this respect. But he looked at them and he said, if you have ever had in your heart a bad thought about another person, then you have killed that person already. In other words, Jesus said that the sin is not a question of what you do, of the action that you take, but of what is going on in your heart and mind. Other people do not see this. Other people do not know that you have these bad thoughts about them in your heart. They may be completely unaware of what is going on in your mind. But the fact that this is happening, that this is going on inside you, that you know about, and that of course God knows about, this is already sinful. It is already something that is wrong in his eyes. So you don't have to do something in order to sin. You can think something, and that thought is already sinful. Now you will turn to me and say, yes, I understand what you are saying about that, but even so, little babies don't think either. They are incapable of this. And that is, of course, true. They don't. But they have the ability, the capacity to do this eventually. In other words, the potential is in them to do this. And when they reach the age when that potential becomes a reality, when they start to exercise the potential, then they will do this. And it is a phenomenon that we observe in every child. We don't teach children to do this. We don't teach children to lie, for example, to their parents. We don't teach children to hide things from their parents, but they do. There's something in them that pushes them in this direction, whether we teach them this or not. In fact, most of the time, we don't teach them this. They pick this up, it seems, naturally. Now, this is a complicated business because we have to say to ourselves, if we don't believe this, what are the consequences? If we think, for example, that a child is born without sin, now the child has no idea what sin is, and does not, of course, does not commit sin, but doesn't even have in him this latent thing, this potential, which when it develops, when it comes to maturity, will sin. What are the consequences for us? Well, of course, if this were true, you see, if it were true that a child is innocent and not affected by sin in any way, then of course it would be much better to be a child, to remain a child, and never grow up. To become an adult would be dangerous. To become an adult would somehow be wrong, because who would want an innocent person suddenly to turn into a guilty person, to someone who is responsible for actions which they would not have committed if they had remained in their primitive state. And yet, there is nothing in the Bible and nothing in reality either which suggests that it's better to be like a little child and not to grow up. In fact, when we meet people like this, when we meet people who have not developed properly, who behave as little children, even though they are not, somehow or other they have not matured in the right way, we think something is wrong with them, that this should not happen, that such a person needs somehow to be corrected, needs to be helped to grow to maturity, to an understanding of how to live their life properly. So we do not admire people who remain like little children in their way of thinking. We suspect that for whatever reason, whether it's a handicap, a disability, or something like that in their life, which has prevented them from growing up, or whether it is just immaturity, that they need a little bit of help to adjust to the world as it is. Whatever the cause, we realize that there is something that is not right and that needs to be corrected. This is not justifying sin. It is not encouraging sin. It is simply recognizing that maturity in a human being is a natural and right thing. We are told, of course, in the New Testament that this is right. Jesus said to his disciples that the little children should be allowed to come to him, because that is what the kingdom of heaven is made of. We need to come as a little child. We need to come in trust and obedience to him. That is true. But, of course, once that happens, because we are born again, we start at the beginning, we have to grow. We have to grow in maturity. And we read, of course, in books like the Epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, that the writer says, he complains because he says, I can't tell you about the deeper things of God because you are not mature enough. You haven't advanced far enough in your faith. You are not able to take the meat of the word. I have to give you milk because you're just not capable of absorbing the higher truths, the deeper realities that we need to understand and appreciate if we are going to live the Christian life. The whole emphasis in the New Testament is that we should grow into maturity. Now, if growing into maturity was in itself a bad thing, of course, the Bible would never recommend this. It would not tell us that this is the way we should go in our own lives. So we cannot accept that way of thinking, that it's somehow better to remain as a little child. Even less can we accept this idea that it would be better to die as a little child and never be exposed to the sinful human life that most of us have to live. You see, this would be a terrible thing if people got the idea that killing their child, killing their baby, was the best way to save them, because they were afraid that if the baby grows up and gets older, the baby will sin and will lose the relationship to God with which it was born. And so in order to prevent that, in order to protect the child from this, you bring their life to an end before that happens, so that you guarantee that they go to heaven. Now, that is, of course, a terrible thing to think. It's a terrible thing to suggest. We must reject this. But if you believe that a child is born innocent and only acquires sin as it grows up, it's not an irrational thing to think. You see, you can justify that way of thinking logically. You can say, well, it makes sense, but it goes completely against everything that we are taught about our life, everything that we are taught about the gift of God, of children to us. There is no advantage in dying young. There is no advantage in refusing to grow up. We don't think this. The reason, of course, we don't think this is that the Lord Jesus Christ came into the world. He was not a sinner. He did not sin. He was protected from original sin, the sin that we have, because although he was born in the womb of Mary and was physically speaking a normal human being, he was conceived by the Holy Spirit. He came from the Father, and therefore did not inherit original sin in the way that the rest of us do, and so he lived a sinless life. But Jesus, as he grew up, was a normal human being. Nobody ever suggested that there was something strange about him, that there was something different about him. He demonstrated by the way he lived that it is possible for a sinless person to live a normal human life. He is the only one who has actually done that. That is true, but it was not something strange or abnormal or anything like that. So we cannot say that sin is somehow natural, that sinfulness is something that we cannot avoid, and that anybody who tries to avoid it or anybody who doesn't sin is somehow not being truly human. Of course, we don't go to the other extreme and say that everything human beings do is fine, is good, that sin is some kind of myth, it is a misunderstanding. We don't say that either, but we recognize that the sinful state in which we find ourselves is not the state that God created us in. It is not what God wants for us, and it is something which can, through his grace, by the death and resurrection of his Son, can be put right, not in this life, not as long as we are children of Adam, but in the next life. We are sinners in need of salvation. But when we are saved, we are not turned into beings who are somehow not really human anymore. We don't become better than other human beings. We don't change into some other kind of reality. We don't become like angels. We remain human beings as we always were, but we are saved by grace through faith. And of course, at some time we will die. The old Adam, the old physical Adam that I am will pass away, and I will come back as a new creature, as a new being in a new life, which will be free of this sinfulness. Now, we need to think a little bit about the consequences of this. I've already said that children are not to be regarded as morally superior, morally or spiritually superior to adults. It's not better to be a child than it is to be grown up. Children, of course, lack the knowledge and lack the abilities, lack the skills that adults have, but that does not make them better as people. They're just as sinful as anyone else, and they will demonstrate this whenever they get the opportunity to do so. The other thing, of course, is that sinfulness is a spiritual thing. It is a spiritual problem, and therefore is not related to physical abilities or physical defects. This is a very serious problem that needs to be addressed, because for many hundreds of years, and still today in certain parts of the world, there are people who think this. They think that if somebody is physically handicapped, they must have done something wrong. This is a curse from God. Somehow or other, they have deserved this. But this is not true. And the Bible is very insistent on this. There's a story you can read for yourself in John chapter 9, where Jesus is confronted with a man who was born blind. And the Jewish leaders of the time, they ask him, they say, who was it who sinned? This man was born blind. Did he sin that would make him blind? No. Did his parents sin? Is it their fault that this man was born blind? And why should the child, suffer for something that the parents had done? Well, Jesus, of course, rejects this. He turns to them and says, no, this is not because of sin that the man is born blind. It is because the glory of God will be manifested in him. And it is at this point, of course, that he proceeds to heal the man who was born blind, to show that this handicap, this defect, can be corrected. It is not the end of the story. Now, we know, of course, that cures of this kind are not common. They certainly cannot be taken for granted. But we also know that just because a person is physically handicapped or mentally handicapped, this does not mean that this person has sinned in a way which is greater than other people have done. We need to be very clear about this in our minds. One of the problems that some Christians face is that they will not baptize people unless they make a profession of faith. In other words, unless you confess your faith in Christ personally, you cannot be baptized. You cannot be admitted into the fellowship of the church. You cannot be regarded as in some way a Christian. Now, if you are a normal person, a normal human being, that might make some sense, because you say, well, if you don't confess your faith, if you don't show any sign of believing, then you cannot be baptized. So there's no meaning to this. And that makes sense in its own way. Yes, we can accept that. But what about somebody who is mentally handicapped? Somebody who cannot make a profession of faith? Someone who lacks the ability to express themselves in that way? Is such a person condemned? Is such a person going to go to hell as a sinner simply because they are physically unable to respond to the preaching of the gospel in the way that normal people can. And this we cannot accept. I'm not here to dictate to people whether such people should be baptized or how they should be treated in a church and so on. This is a matter, that individual churches have to decide for themselves. But to say that such a person cannot be saved, that such a person cannot be brought into the family and household of God, because of this physical or mental disability that they have, this is wrong. That such a person has come into the world not in order to be condemned, but in order that the glory of God should somehow be manifested in them. And of course we see this so many ways in the way that we treat people. Christian people have a completely different attitude to those who are physically and mentally handicapped than other people do, because we do not regard these people as lost. We regard these people as human beings with a potential, as human beings who can nevertheless, despite their handicap, somehow live for the glory of God. And we do our best to try to make this happen. I think one of the most remarkable things that we have seen in recent years is the way in which people with disabilities have been encouraged to live lives which are as fulfilling and as normal as possible. I don't know about you, but when I look at the Olympic Games, for example, I'm always very impressed with the athletic abilities of those who compete. But to my mind, the most interesting thing is what happens after the Olympics when there is another set of games called the Paralympics, which take place. And this is when people with physical disabilities of various kinds compete. And the things that they are able to achieve, the medals that they are able to win, to my mind, are more significant. They speak more loudly to the human capacity for development, the human capacity for achieving the glory of God, than the ordinary people do, the ones who are not handicapped. The ones who are not handicapped, you kind of expect that they're just developing their own natural abilities. But these others are fighting a struggle. They're fighting against something, and they nevertheless manage to triumph. And as Christians, we need to support this. We need to say, yes, that we do not understand why the man was born blind. We don't know why physical handicaps exist in many cases, why people are mentally handicapped. We cannot say what the reason for this is very often. But nevertheless, these people are given to us. They are gifts from God. And we need to work with them, we need to appreciate them, and above all, we must not blame sin for having caused this. The same, of course, is true of intelligence. Some people think that if you are bright, if you are intelligent, if you do good work in school, that somehow you are better than others. That people who are not very intelligent, people who are stupid in one way or another, or just incapable of doing good academic work, that these people are somehow in the wrong relationship with God. Well, of course, we're all in the wrong relationship with God. It doesn't matter how intelligent or how unintelligent you are. That is not the criterion by which we judge these things. And we need to be aware of this, because some people, I don't know why it is, but they think that if you have a PhD, if you are a doctor or something, you're somehow more spiritual than if you don't. And of course, we cannot say that that every person is in the same position. And indeed, those who have intelligence, those who have greater abilities, may be in a worse position than others, because it is their very ability, their very mental ability, which allows them to sin more. You see, there are some people who will look at great evil men in the history of the world. One of the favorites now is people look at Adolf Hitler in Germany, and they say, well, there's a person who is definitely in hell. There's a person who has done something far worse than any other human being has done. But the truth of the matter is that you and I are not better than Adolf Hitler was. We don't perhaps sin to the degree that he did, but that is because we don't have the opportunity to do this. You see, we're not in the same position. Personally, I am very thankful that I am not in that position. I don't have to worry about this. So I'm grateful for that. But to claim that somehow he is worse than I am, that is not true. You see, because in my heart and in my mind and in my life, the ability, the capacity for evil is just as great as it was in him. So we need to understand that and recognize that. Now, moving on to our next thing, our next question. We have not caused sin in our life. Sin has come to us, whether we like it or not. But we are responsible for doing something about it. I am not guilty in the sense that I have done something wrong myself. But I am guilty if I do not take the responsibility for what I have inherited and try to put it right. And this is where the guilt of the fallen human race comes from. It's not what we have done ourselves, but our failure to put it right. You see, we know that something has gone wrong. We may try to put it right. We may want to put it right, but we cannot do this. And for this reason, we are guilty before God. Because all we can really do as we develop, as we grow, as we expand and work out the commission that God has given us to develop the world is to spread the curse of sin. You see, with every new development, with every new technology, with every new invention that people have, there is good and bad together. Today we live in a world where many wonderful things are possible. We have control over nuclear power, for example. We have very advanced technology. We can do many great and wonderful things. But we also know that evil people, people with bad intentions, can use these things for their own purposes. Why? Because the things in themselves are neither good nor bad. They are tools. They are things which are given to us, or which we have developed, and which can be used by different people for different purposes. Who would have believed, for example, 100 years ago, that it would be possible to destroy the entire world? And yet we know, with the development of atomic energy, that it is now possible to make weapons which are capable of doing this. You see, years ago, it was difficult for people let me take one example. It was difficult for people to get access to pornography. When I was a child, I had no idea what pornography was. I would not have known where to go to get it, and even if I had found it in some way or other, probably it would have been in a shop, and the owner of the shop would have refused to sell it to me because I was a child. And that, of course, was a good thing. But now, all I need is a computer to sit at home, to know how to press the buttons the right way, and I can have access to all the pornography that I want. Well, perhaps not the pornography that I want, but all the pornography that exists. I don't particularly want it, and I want to keep it out of my life. But I have access to it now in a way that I did not before. This is the fruit of the development of technology, and we need to recognize this, because there are some people who think that science will solve all our problems, that all we have to do is develop it in the right way, and that when all the diseases are cured, when all the ignorance is banished, when all the hindrances, all the things that prevent us from living an ordinary and developed life, as soon as this is taken away, then perfection, paradise will be introduced. But this is wrong. As Christians, we have to say no, because the problem is not in the outside world. The problem is in the human heart. And this we take with us, whatever the outward circumstances may be, whatever the world is like. I cannot change what is inside me. Now, in the Bible, there is the story of Noah and the flood. And this story is very interesting because God saw how sin was spreading. You see how the human race was growing and expanding, but taking its sinfulness with it. And the world was full of sin. And so he decided he was going to destroy the world. You see that the world would be wiped out, except for Noah and his family, and that they would start over again. You see, there'd be a new beginning in this respect. And so the world was destroyed in the flood. Noah and his family survived. But when Noah and his family came out of the ark and began to live again, sin continued to grow and exist. Why? Because it was in them. You read the story of Noah and his family. They were not perfect people. And so when they came back, you see, after the flood, maybe the sin of the past was taken away, but there were new opportunities for sin. There was a fresh development in this way. It was not the answer to the problem. And this, of course, is still true today, that every once in a while we can do things. We say we're going to get rid of sin. There is corruption in the world. So what do? Well, we're going to have a revolution, or we're going to overthrow the government, or we're going to kill all the people who have done bad things. And for a while, it seems that there's some kind of purification, that there's some kind of new beginning which is promised to us. But it doesn't take long before that new beginning turns into a new form of sinfulness. Why? Because the problem was never in the outside structures. You see, in the system that had existed before, the problem was always in the human heart. And when it comes back, when the human beings think they are making a new beginning, but in fact they are not. The truth is that all human beings have a knowledge of good and evil. The fact that we have this, the fact that there is some knowledge of good in us, shows that there is some knowledge of God which has remained. because to know what is good is to be aware of the God who is good, who made it like that. But it competes with evil. And indeed, we cannot live in a way which is totally good. So what do? We try to resolve this problem by inventing stories, by inventing myths, as we say, in order to explain what has gone wrong. These myths can be very complicated. They can be very sophisticated. You get sometimes philosophers who dream, and they produce most amazing explanations for the problems that we have in human life. Of course, they offer also solutions to these problems, and we will be looking at these in the next lectures that we have. But the truth is that these exercises of the human imagination are fantasy, they are not fact. What we have done, and what is always the case, is that the worship of the Creator, the worship of our Creator, has been replaced by the worship of His creatures, and ultimately by the worship of the self. Because I always want to be my own God. I want to be the one who decides what is good and what is evil. I want to be the one to choose what is right and what is wrong. And because I put myself at the center of my existence, because I think that I can do this and I can get away with this, then I am guilty of what the Bible calls idolatry. Idolatry is the worship of a thing and not of the one who made that thing. And even if it's the worship of myself, I am idolatrous in this way. I have given into this. You don't have to make a statue and bow down to worship it. Idolatry is a spiritual disease. It is something which affects us inside. And in the world in which we live, the human mind, human reason, is the ultimate form of idolatry. This is the idolatry which is officially approved by everybody. That people think, well, if you use your mind, if you use your reason, you can avoid sin, you can avoid problems. Now, this is the most serious sin of all. Why? Not because reason is a bad thing, or because reason is inadequate or anything like that. Reason is a very good thing. It's a very necessary thing. As Christians, we need to use it, and we need to recognize it. But reason is a means to an end. It is not the end in itself. Reason is a process of thinking. It is not the object of thinking. And it's when we turn away from this, when we realize that it's not an end in itself, but it is a tool, it is something that we use and are meant to use in order to do what is right and to do what is good. If we do that, then we are corrupting the use of our reason. And this, of course, is what has happened in the modern world. This is why people put false hope in science. Science is not an end in itself. Science is a means to an end. It is a tool which we are called to use. The real question is, what are we using it for? What is the purpose of this? Why are we developing the world? I mean, what is our goal? Where are we going with this? Development by itself is not the answer. Development must have a purpose, and that purpose does not come from the development itself. It can only come from the Creator who has given us the ability to do these things. This is the heart of the problem. This is where the rejection of God's love is at its most serious point. And it is these things that we need to look at in the lectures ahead. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our first lecture now, and I look forward to seeing you again in the second lecture, which we will have to follow on from this one. Thank you again.